The choice that changed everything. The wail of sirens cut through the cold night air, blending with the distant hum of the city. Inside the speeding ambulance, Dr. Richard Monroe tightened his grip on the edge of the stretcher as the paramedics relayed the details of the incoming patient. The metallic scent of blood was thick in the confined space, and the young man on the gurney was barely clinging to life. Multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. The paramedic reported over the roar of the sirens. BP's crashing. Pupils sluggish. He was found in an alley off 23rd Street. No ID. Richard didn't react outwardly. Decades of experience had taught him to maintain composure, to detach himself from the person beneath the blood and bandages, and to see only the problem that needed solving. Yet there was something about this case that made his stomach twist, a faint sense of unease he couldn't quite place. "He's not going to make it if we don't get him on that table now," Richard muttered, already calculating the odds, the surgical procedures, the minutes they had left. He pressed 2 fingers to the young man's carotid artery. Weak pulse. The kid was barely hanging on. The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of Metropolitan General Hospital, the back doors flying open before the vehicle had fully stopped. Richard jumped out alongside the paramedics as they rushed the gurney through the sliding glass doors of the ER, where the usual chaos of the emergency ward unfolded. Doctors barking orders, patients groaning in pain, machines beeping in frantic rhythms. "Get him to OR 3. Richard commanded as he fell into step with the gurney, moving at a near run. "I want Dr. Carter in the room. And someone page anesthesia now." The bright white lights of the operating room swallowed them whole as the doors swung shut behind them. Nurses and surgical techs moved like clockwork, snapping gloves into place, adjusting IV drips, calling out vitals. Richard took a deep breath and let himself slip into the only world that ever truly made sense to him, the world where he was in control, where he could take something broken and mend it stitch by stitch. Scalpel, forceps, clamp. His hands moved automatically, each incision a calculated step toward saving the young man's life. His assistant, Dr. Emily Carter, worked beside him, her face a mask of concentration as she clamped off bleeders and suctioned away the excess blood. "He's losing too much," she warned. Richard gritted his teeth. "Not on my table, he isn't." His fingers worked with meticulous precision, repairing what they could, stabilizing what they couldn't. Time became irrelevant, existing only in the rhythm of the machines and the steady beat of his own heart as he fought to keep the young man tethered to life. The patient crashed, twice, the flatline scream of the monitor sending a jolt of adrenaline through Richard's veins each time. Defibrillator pads, a shock that lifted the body an inch off the table. A silent, breathless second before the beep, beep, beep returned, weak but steady. After 5 hours of battle, the fight was finally won. Vitals stable, a nurse confirmed, her voice almost disbelieving. Richard exhaled, stepping back. His surgical gown was soaked through, his muscles screamed in exhaustion, but it didn't matter. He had saved another life. Just another nameless face. Just another routine case. Or so he thought. Hours later, the recovery room. The hospital had settled into its quieter rhythm by the time Richard made his way toward the post-op recovery room. 3 a.m. The time when the city outside was at its darkest, when even the busiest hospitals felt almost empty. The young man was still unconscious, his chest rising and falling steadily beneath the white hospital blanket. Wires snaked across his body, feeding information to the machines that stood guard beside him. Richard sighed, grabbing the clipboard at the foot of the bed. He scanned the details, notes from the trauma team, medications, blood transfusions, but the name field remained empty. John Doe, another lost soul. He set the clipboard down, his exhaustion finally creeping in. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline, and his body ached in protest. He pulled back the blanket just enough to check the surgical site, ensuring there was no fresh bleeding. And that's when his world stopped. His breath hitched, His fingers froze. Right there, just below the collarbone, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. A birthmark he had seen before. A birthmark he had memorized 28 years ago. The clipboard slipped from his grasp, crashing onto the floor in the dead silence of the hospital room. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The sterile walls around him suddenly felt suffocating, the air too thin. No, it wasn't possible. It couldn't be. His mind fought against the truth, clinging desperately to the logic that had governed his entire life. But the evidence was there, staring back at him, burned into his memory like a scar that never faded. This wasn't just a patient. This was his son, the son he had abandoned, the son he had walked away from before he ever had the chance to hold him. The lifeless body on the table had belonged to his flesh and blood. And he hadn't even known. A surge of nausea rolled through him as 28 years of regret came crashing down in an instant. How had his son ended up bleeding in an alley? How had his son ended up a nameless John Doe? And when he woke up, would he ever be able to forgive Richard for the choice that had changed both their lives forever? The beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, but to Richard, it sounded like a ticking clock. A countdown to the moment his son would open his eyes and face the man who had abandoned him. A past that refuses to stay buried. The steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor filled the recovery room, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Richard Monroe. He sat frozen in the hard plastic chair beside the bed, his mind refusing to process what his eyes had already confirmed. The young man lying unconscious before him wasn't just another patient. He was Ryan, his son, the son he had abandoned 28 years ago. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears as he reached for the medical chart with unsteady hands. His fingers gripped the edge of the clipboard so tightly it left indentations in his skin. His breath came in shallow bursts as he forced himself to read the details again, looking for any excuse, any logical explanation that could make this not true. But there it was. Name: Ryan Dawson. Age: 28. No emergency contacts. No listed address. No known family. Richard's stomach twisted painfully. Ryan had no one. He flipped through the hospital records, his surgeon's mind cataloging every entry with ruthless efficiency, even as his heart cracked wider with each new page. Multiple ER visits for minor injuries. Foster home placements between the ages of 2 and 17. Juvenile detention at 16 for theft. Arrested at 19 for vagrancy. No permanent employment. No fixed address. Medical history marked by years of untreated injuries, malnutrition, and exposure. A life of struggle. A life lived in the margins. A life spent fighting to survive. And where had Richard been? Standing in operating rooms, receiving awards, building a life of prestige and power, while his own flesh and blood had been thrown to the wolves. His hands trembled as he reached for Ryan's wrist, carefully pressing his fingers against his pulse point. The rhythm was steady, but weak. His body still hadn't fully recovered from the massive blood loss. How the hell had it come to this? A father was supposed to protect his child, raise him, give him the world, not leave him in it alone to fend for himself. The hospital room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, suffocating him. A tightness gripped Richard's chest, one he hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't stress, wasn't exhaustion. It was guilt. He wiped a hand over his face, the reality sinking in like cement hardening around his ribs. I abandoned him. And now he's here, bleeding, alone, because of me. A weak groan from the hospital bed snapped Richard out of his thoughts. Ryan was waking up. The awakening. Ryan Dawson felt like he was drowning. His body was heavy, his limbs sluggish. There was pressure in his chest, a deep ache radiating from his side. A beeping sound pierced through the haze, pulling him toward wakefulness against his will. He tried to move, but something was wrong. Pain exploded through his body, sharp and unforgiving, forcing a strangled gasp from his throat. Easy. The voice was deep, calm, authoritative. Ryan's eyelids fluttered open, the bright hospital lights stabbing into his skull like knives. His throat felt like sandpaper, his tongue dry and useless. A figure loomed above him, slightly out of focus. A doctor. Ryan's muscles tensed on instinct, his heartbeat spiking. Every time he woke up in a hospital, it meant bad news. Either a bill he couldn't pay or cops waiting outside his door. "Where?" he croaked, barely recognizing his own voice. "You're at Metropolitan General Hospital," the man replied, his voice low but steady. "You were attacked. Stab wounds. You lost a lot of blood." Ryan's brain struggled to catch up. Stabbing. Blood. Cold alley. Flashes of the fight came rushing back. The knife slicing through his side. The red pooling beneath him. The darkness swallowing him whole. He tried to sit up, panic flaring in his chest, but the pain stopped him cold. His fingers gripped the sheets, white-knuckled, as a groan escaped him. "Take it slow," the doctor said, his hands hovering near him, but not touching. Ryan blinked against the pain, his vision sharpening as he finally got a clear look at the man standing beside the bed. Tall, late 50s, expensive suit beneath the white coat, sharp blue eyes lined with exhaustion, salt and pepper hair, a watch that looked like it cost more than every dollar Ryan had ever held in his life. A doctor. No, not just any doctor. Ryan's stomach turned to ice as he recognized the man standing over him. The world tilted. His breath hitched. It couldn't be. Could it? Ryan's gaze drifted lower, settling on the man's trembling hands. It was slight, barely noticeable, but it was there. Fear or regret? Maybe both. Ryan's chest constricted, his head buzzing with denial. He'd seen this man before. In newspaper articles, on TV, on hospital walls. He wasn't just some random doctor. He was Dr. Richard Monroe. And Dr. Richard Monroe was his father. Ryan's pulse skyrocketed, the heart monitor blaring in alarm. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as panic took hold. No, no, no. This had to be some sick joke. Or maybe the blood loss was messing with his head. Maybe he was still in the alley, hallucinating, dying. Richard must have seen the recognition in his eyes, because his face paled, his hands gripping the edge of the hospital bed like an anchor. "Ryan," his voice cracked. Shut up." Ryan's voice was hoarse, but the venom in it was unmistakable. His father's lips pressed together, his jaw tightening. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, like a lightning strike, it hit him. This man had saved his life. Ryan let out a humorless laugh, a sound so bitter it burned. "Guess it's funny, huh?" His voice was weak, but his eyes burned with fury. "The man who left me to rot is the same man who pulled me back." Richard flinched. Ryan felt something ugly rise in his chest, something raw and bleeding. A part of him wanted to rip the IV from his arm, throw himself out of the bed, walk out, disappear. But another part of him, the part still aching from wounds that went deeper than any knife, wanted answers. He swallowed, his throat raw. His hand shook against the sheets. His father stood before him, the man who had never been there. The man who had left before he ever had the chance to know him. The air crackled with everything left unsaid. Ryan's voice was quiet, but deadly. "Tell me, Doc," he said, his lips curling into something cold and cruel. "Did you even know my name before tonight?" Richard's mouth opened, then closed. And that silence told Ryan everything. The ruins of what could have been. The hospital room felt too small. The air was thick, choking, filled with a silence more painful than words could ever be. Ryan's breath came shallow, his chest rising and falling in shaky bursts, his body stiff with tension as he stared at the man who called himself his father. Richard Monroe, world-renowned surgeon, medical genius, and the man who had abandoned him before he ever had a chance to know him. Ryan swallowed back the bile rising in his throat, his fingers gripping the hospital sheets like a lifeline. His whole body ached, but it wasn't from the stitches pulling at his side. It was something deeper, something older, something that had been there his whole life. Richard's mouth opened, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, anything. But no words came. Ryan let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head. His voice was hoarse, raw with anger and exhaustion. "Nothing," he rasped, blinking at his father. "You got nothing." Richard's jaw clenched, the muscles working beneath his skin. His eyes, those same blue eyes Ryan saw in the mirror every day, looked heavy, clouded with something like guilt. Ryan felt something in his chest tighten, sharp and painful, but he crushed it down. He wouldn't let himself feel anything for this man. Not now. Not ever. Richard tried again, but Ryan cut him off. "You didn't even know my name before tonight, did you?" Ryan spat, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Richard flinched, and that was all the confirmation Ryan needed. A sharp laugh tore from Ryan's throat. But it wasn't amusement. It was pain wrapped in jagged glass. He shook his head, his throat burning. "Jesus Christ, 28 years. You're a doctor, right? That means you know how many seconds are in 28 years. Do the math." His voice cracked. "How many seconds have you had to look for me? To even wonder where the hell I ended up?" Richard swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. "Ryan, please. Don't." Ryan's breathing hitched, his fingers curling into fists, the IV line in his arm tugging slightly. He didn't care. "You're standing there like this is some goddamn tragic coincidence," Ryan hissed. "Like I just happened to land on your operating table by accident." He let out a humorless snort. "You want to know the real joke, Doc?" Richard's breathing was uneven now, his shoulders stiff, his hands still shaking at his sides. Ryan's eyes locked onto him, cold and unrelenting. "It took me nearly dying in a goddamn alley for you to even know I existed." The words hung between them, a gaping wound neither could close. Richard ran a hand down his face, his fingers trembling slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I deserve that," he admitted, his gaze never leaving Ryan's. Ryan scoffed. "No, you don't get to decide that. You don't get to decide what you deserve." He gritted his teeth, his heart hammering in his chest. "You don't get to stand here and pretend you care now." Richard exhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists. "I do care." Ryan's head snapped toward him so fast it made his stitches pull. The pain barely registered beneath the weight of his fury. "You care?" Ryan's voice was low, dangerous. "Where was all that caring when I was 6 years old, being dragged from one shitty foster home to another?" His breath came faster. "Where was all that caring when I was eating from dumpsters at 14 because I'd rather starve than stay in a group home where I'd get my ribs broken for looking at someone the wrong way?" Richard's face had gone pale, his knuckles white where they rested against the rail of Ryan's hospital bed. "Where were you, Ryan's voice rose, his anger bubbling over. "When I was 16 and I spent my goddamn birthday sleeping under a bridge. When I was 19 and spent 3 months in county for stealing food because I was so goddamn hungry." His hands shook against the sheets. "Where the hell were you?" Richard's throat bobbed, but no words came. Ryan's chest ached, the weight of the past pressing down on him, squeezing his lungs until it was hard to breathe. "You don't get to care now," Ryan whispered, his voice like broken glass. "You don't get to walk in here and fix this like it's just another surgery." Richard's face twisted like he'd been stabbed. "Ryan, I know I messed up," he said, his voice thick. "I know. God, I know I can't take back what I did. But Ryan turned away, his throat tight, his eyes burning. "Just leave," he muttered. Richard's breath hitched. "What?" Ryan shut his eyes. "Leave." His voice was quieter now. "I don't want to do this. I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want to hear your guilt. And I sure as hell don't want to see you standing there looking at me like I'm some kind of goddamn miracle. Silence. Then, finally, Richard exhaled. A slow, painful sound. Ryan expected to hear footsteps. Expected to hear the door open. Expected to be left behind again. Instead, no. Ryan's eyes snapped open, his head turning so fast, he nearly ripped out his IV. Richard stood his ground, his jaw set, his blue eyes harder than before. Ryan's heart pounded. "What?" he breathed. "I said no," Richard repeated, his voice steady. "I'm not leaving." Ryan let out a hollow laugh. "What, so now you're a father?" Richard stepped closer, his hands shaking at his sides. "No," he admitted, his voice low, raw. "I wasn't. Not for a single second of your life." Ryan stilled. Richard swallowed hard. "I told myself I was making the right choice, that you'd have a better life without me." His voice cracked. "And that was the biggest mistake of my goddamn life." Ryan's fingers curled into the sheets. Richard took another step forward, his face unreadable. "I won't walk away again," he said. "Not this time." Ryan's heart was beating so loudly, he was sure the monitors could hear it. His father's words shouldn't mean anything. They should feel hollow. But they didn't. They felt like something he'd wanted to hear his entire goddamn life. And that was the worst part, because he didn't know if he could believe them. He didn't know if he could believe in anything anymore. Ryan turned his face toward the window, his hands clenched tight enough to hurt. "You don't get to walk away this time, huh?" He let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "We'll see." Richard didn't move, didn't speak. He just stayed. And for the first time in 28 years, someone didn't leave. A lifetime of silence, a moment of truth. The beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound between them, a rhythmic reminder that Ryan was still here. Still breathing, still alive, but barely. Richard Monroe sat in the stiff hospital chair, staring at the son he never raised, the boy he had walked away from before he ever had the chance to know him. His hands, steady in surgery, unshakable in the operating room, trembled in his lap. He had spent decades stitching people back together, but right now, he had no idea how to fix the damage he had caused. Ryan had stopped looking at him. His face was turned toward the window, the late afternoon light cutting sharp shadows across his pale skin. The fading bruises on his face, the tension in his shoulders, the scars Richard could see, and the ones he couldn't. They told a story he had never been a part of. And maybe Ryan was right. Maybe he had no right to care now. But he did. God, he did. For the first time since the moment he'd recognized that crescent-shaped birthmark on his son's collarbone, Richard didn't know what to say. What could he say? "I'm sorry" wouldn't fix 28 years of absence. "I regret" it wouldn't erase the nights Ryan had spent alone in the cold. "I never stopped thinking about you" would be a damn lie, because the truth was, Richard had spent years trying not to think about the child he had abandoned. And yet here they were. Fate, or cruelty, had placed his son on his operating table, bleeding out from stab wounds in an alleyway, homeless, alone, lost. And now Richard was the only one here. His son had no one else, because he hadn't fought for him. Ryan shifted in the hospital bed, winced, then let out a slow breath. His eyes flickered toward Richard, just for a second, before he looked away again. Richard had seen that look before, in trauma patients, in people who had been through too much too young. Distrust, resentment, fear of false hope. "I don't know what you want from me," Ryan muttered. His voice was quiet, almost like he was talking to himself. "You don't get to walk in here and act like you suddenly give a damn." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. "I know." His voice sounded too rough, too raw. "And I know nothing I say is going to fix what I did." Ryan let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Then why are you here?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Because I should have been here a long time ago." Ryan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into the thin hospital blanket. "Yeah, Well, you weren't. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. I was 24, he said, his voice quieter now. Fresh out of medical school. Ambitious. Focused. Too damn selfish to see what was right in front of me. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. When your mother told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I told myself I wasn't ready, that I had to focus on my career first. Ryan's fingers twitched against the sheets, but he didn't look at him. Richard forced himself to keep going, even though every word felt like a knife digging deeper into his own flesh. I walked away. His voice was softer now, filled with something raw. I thought it was the right thing at the time, that I was doing you a favor. He swallowed hard. But I wasn't. I was just being a coward. Ryan scoffed. No kidding. Richard flinched, but he deserved that. Ryan finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Richard's. There was rage there, burning and sharp, but beneath it, buried deep, was something worse. Hurt. So what? Ryan's voice was sharp. You just left, signed a couple papers, wiped your hands clean, and went on with your perfect life. Richard's throat went dry. No, he admitted. Your mother. She wanted to keep you. His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time in years, he let himself remember. She begged me to stay. She said we could figure it out together. He exhaled. But I wouldn't listen. I told myself you'd be better off without me. Ryan stared at him, ice cold. Guess that worked out real well, huh? Richard clenched his fists. His whole chest ached, his ribs pressing in on his lungs like a vice. I was wrong, he whispered. God, Ryan, I was so damn wrong. Ryan's jaw twitched. He turned back toward the window, shaking his head. Doesn't change anything. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. I know, but I'm here now. Ryan let out a harsh laugh, but there was no humor in it. You keep saying that like it means something. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. Like you expect me to just… What? Accept it, trust you, let you make up for 28 years in one goddamn hospital visit. He shook his head. It doesn't work like that. Richard nodded slowly. I don't expect that. Ryan's hands trembled slightly against the blanket. Then what do you expect? Richard hesitated. What did he expect? Forgiveness. No, he didn't deserve that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. A chance. Maybe, but even that felt like asking for too much. But there was one thing he wanted, one thing he needed. I just want to know you, Richard said, his voice steady. That's all. Ryan's expression flickered, something passing through his eyes too fast to name. But he didn't tell Richard to leave. And for now, that was enough. Later that night, Ryan couldn't sleep. His body ached. His stitches pulled with every movement. But it wasn't just the physical pain keeping him awake. It was him. The man sleeping in the chair beside his hospital bed. His father. Richard had stayed. Hours had passed. Nurses had come and gone. And still, he hadn't left. He had sat there, reading medical journals, occasionally checking Ryan's monitors like he couldn't help himself. And now he was asleep, his head tilted slightly to the side, arms crossed over his chest. Ryan hated that a part of him had expected him to leave. Because that's what people did. They left. His foster parents, his caseworkers, the cops who arrested him when he was 19. And his father, the first person who had ever abandoned him. Ryan hated him. He should have walked out of this hospital the moment he was strong enough. He should have disappeared into the streets again, left this place behind, left him behind. But for some stupid, messed up reason, he hadn't. And that scared him more than anything. Ryan turned onto his side, his bruised ribs protesting the movement. His eyes flickered back to Richard, still asleep in the chair. For the first time in his life, Ryan felt like someone was staying. and he didn't know what to do with that. The weight of a name. The dim hospital light cast long shadows against the pale blue walls, giving the room an eerie stillness. Ryan hadn't spoken in over an hour. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, the slow beep of the heart monitor the only thing filling the silence. Richard remained in his chair, posture rigid, hands clasped tightly together. His white coat was draped over the armrest, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, as if he were still mid-surgery, trying to fix something that had already been broken beyond repair. Neither of them knew how to navigate this moment. Ryan felt exposed, like an open wound. Richard felt helpless, like a surgeon forced to watch his patient bleed out with no way to stop it. "You have my name." Ryan's voice broke the silence, rough and dry from disuse. Richard looked up, confused. "What?" Ryan swallowed, still staring at the ceiling. His fingers absently picked at the blanket draped over him, his movements slow, almost unconscious. "You gave me your name," he murmured. His voice wasn't angry this time. Just tired. Ryan Monroe. That's what it was supposed to be, wasn't it? Richard's chest tightened. It was such a small thing. A name. And yet, it was everything. His grip on the armrest tightened. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "It was." Ryan let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Guess that didn't stick, huh?" Richard flinched. "Your mother." He cleared his throat. "She changed it after I left. I don't blame her." Ryan finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Richard's. "Did you ever think about me?" His voice was calm, too calm. Richard felt the weight of that question crush him. Every part of him wanted to lie. To say yes, of course. To say he had spent every day wondering where his son was, what kind of life he was living. But that would be dishonest. Richard Monroe was a lot of things: a surgeon, a coward, a man who had spent decades running from his worst mistake. But he had never been a liar. So he answered truthfully. "Not at first," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "At first, I convinced myself you were better off, that someone else would give you the life I couldn't. So I didn't think about it." Ryan's expression didn't change, but Richard saw the small, almost imperceptible way his hands clenched into fists. "But then, years passed," Richard continued, his throat dry. "And I started wondering where you were, who you were, whether you hated me." He let out a hollow laugh. "I guess I got my answer." Ryan's jaw tensed. "And what?" "You just never checked." Richard exhaled sharply. "I tried once," he admitted, "years ago. I looked into the adoption records, but there was nothing. I assumed." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "No, that's not an excuse. I should have looked harder." Ryan's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond, but Richard could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. The silence stretched between them again, thick and heavy. Then Ryan spoke. "I used to make up stories," he said suddenly. His voice was quiet, like he wasn't even sure he wanted to say it out loud. Richard straightened slightly. "Stories?" Ryan nodded slowly, still staring at the ceiling. "When I was a kid, I used to pretend you were some kind of hero." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Not a doctor. A soldier or a spy or, I don't know, something important." His voice grew distant. "I told myself you had to leave. That it wasn't because you didn't want me. It was because you were saving the world or something." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Ryan finally looked at him again. "Guess that was a pretty stupid thing to believe, huh?" Richard's throat tightened, and for the first time since this conversation started, he felt his control slip. "It wasn't stupid," he said, his voice raw. "It was what you needed to believe." Ryan studied him for a long moment. Too long. Then his gaze shifted away. "I stopped telling those stories when I was 12. Richard felt something inside him shatter. His mind drifted to the foster care reports he had read earlier, the clinical, detached language that barely scratched the surface of his son's suffering. Age 12. Difficulty bonding with foster families. Prone to running away. Displays aggressive behavior. The anger. The abandonment issues. The walls Ryan had built around himself like armor. That was when he had stopped believing in the stories. That was when he had given up on the idea of a father altogether. Richard closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He wanted to fix this, but he knew he couldn't. He had already lost 28 years. But maybe, just maybe, he still had time to earn one more day. One day at a time. Later that night, an unspoken truth. Ryan didn't sleep. He pretended to, kept his eyes shut, focused on the steady hum of the hospital machines, but his mind was still racing. Because for the first time in years, someone had stayed. Richard Monroe, his father, was still in that chair, barely moving, barely making a sound. It was unnerving. Ryan had been alone his whole life. Even when he was surrounded by people, he was always alone. But tonight he wasn't. He could hear Richard breathing, slow and even. He could hear the rustling of paper, probably medical notes or some journal article Richard was pretending to read. The man who had walked away from him all those years ago had stayed. Ryan hated how much that mattered. Hated how a part of him wanted to believe him. Hated that even after everything, the anger, the abandonment, the years of nothing, a small, stupid part of him was still that 12-year-old boy waiting for his father to come back. His fingers curled into the blanket. Don't be an idiot, Ryan. He's just here out of guilt. He'll leave the second you stop being his problem. But another part of him, a weaker part, whispered back, then why is he still here? Ryan exhaled slowly, shifting slightly in the bed. His body still ached, but he ignored it. Richard's voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant. You're awake, aren't you? Ryan hesitated for a second. Then, sighing, he cracked one eye open. Maybe. Richard smirked slightly, just barely. You were never a good liar. Ryan let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, and you were never a good father. The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. But Richard didn't flinch, didn't get angry. He just nodded. You're right. Ryan blinked. That was not the response he expected. Richard shifted in his chair, looking at him carefully. But I'd like to try, he said, his voice low. If you'll let me. Ryan's chest tightened. He turned his gaze back toward the ceiling. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. And maybe for now, that was enough. The edge of forgiveness, the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor felt like a countdown to what Ryan didn't know. His stitches ached, his ribs burned, but that wasn't why he was awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling of a hospital room that felt too small, too quiet, too filled with things left unsaid. Across the room, Richard sat in the same stiff chair he had been in for hours, his head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed, his breath slow and even. But Ryan knew the truth. Richard wasn't asleep. He could see the way his father's fingers twitched slightly in his lap, how his breathing wasn't quite deep enough to be real rest. He was pretending, just like Ryan was pretending not to notice. Cowards, both of us. Ryan swallowed, his throat dry. His body was weak, but his mind was a storm, restless and loud. He hadn't meant to say it earlier. You were never a good father. The words had left his mouth before he even had time to think about them. But Richard hadn't gotten angry. He hadn't denied it. He had just agreed. And somehow, that had been worse. Ryan turned his head slightly, studying the man who shared his blood but not his life. His father. The man who had saved his life before knowing he was his son. The man who had left him before he even had a chance to love him. The man who was still here. Ryan hated that part the most. Because if Richard had left by now, it would have been easier. If Richard had stormed out after the fight, after all the anger and resentment Ryan threw at him, this would make sense. But he didn't. He stayed. And that was the problem. Because now, for the first time in years, Ryan didn't know what to do. The next morning, an unwanted visitor. Ryan woke up to the sound of voices outside his hospital room. At first, he ignored them. But then, he recognized one. His body went stiff. No, not now. Not here. The door opened, and there she was. Anna Dawson, Ryan's foster mother, the only one who had ever come close to being a real mother to him. Her dark, tired eyes swept the room, locking onto him with something between relief and heartbreak. She looked older than he remembered, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined with worry. "Oh, Ryan." Her voice cracked. Ryan felt something cold settle in his chest. She looked at him like he was still that angry 17-year-old kid, lost and unreachable. Like she had been waiting for this moment, for the call that he was in another hospital, another jail cell, another place he barely survived. He clenched his jaw, shifting slightly in the bed. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, but he didn't care. Anna hesitated. "Dr. Monroe called me." Ryan's blood went cold. His eyes snapped to Richard, who had just risen from his chair, rubbing a hand over his tired face. Ryan's pulse spiked. "You had no right." "She had every right," Richard cut in. His tone was calm, but firm. "She raised you." Ryan wanted to throw something. "That doesn't mean you get to make that decision for me." "Somebody had to." Ryan's hands shook against the sheets. "So what, you just get to step in and start making choices now?" Richard took a slow breath. "You almost died, Ryan." His voice was measured, controlled. "You have people who care about you, whether you want to admit it or not." Ryan turned his burning glare back to Anna. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look surprised. She just looked tired. Like she had been waiting for this fight too. "I told you, I don't need help," Ryan muttered. Anna shook her head. "You've been saying that since you were 15. Ryan's fists clenched. Silence stretched between them. Thick, heavy, full of old wounds that never really healed. Richard broke it first. "Ryan, let her talk." Ryan turned to him, seething. "You don't get to tell me what to do." Richard met his glare with an unreadable expression. "No," he admitted. "I don't. But you should listen anyway." Ryan scoffed, looking away. "Whatever." Anna hesitated, her hands tightening around the strap of her purse. "I tried to find you, Ryan," she said softly. Ryan's chest tightened. "Yeah, guess you didn't try hard enough." Anna flinched, but she didn't back down. "You ran, Ryan," she said quietly. "Every time things got hard, you ran." Ryan's jaw locked. She wasn't wrong. He hated that she wasn't wrong. "I wasn't gonna stick around waiting to get kicked out," he muttered. Anna exhaled, rubbing her forehead. "I never wanted you gone." Ryan scoffed. "Then why'd you let me leave?" Silence. Ryan hated it. Hated the way the truth pressed down on him. Hated the way Richard was just standing there, watching this unfold like he was trying to understand a puzzle that made no sense. "I didn't know how to make you stay," Anna admitted, "and I regret that every day." Ryan swallowed. His throat felt too tight. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that she was here, too, stirring up everything he had spent years burying. He shook his head, staring at the ceiling. "I don't want to talk about this." Anna studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I'll be outside." She walked past Richard, pausing only to give him a knowing look, a look that said, "Don't give up on him." Then she was gone. The door clicked shut. Ryan exhaled sharply, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. Everything hurt. Physically, emotionally, all of it. He heard Richard move, but he didn't look at him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, "She cares about you," Richard said quietly. Ryan let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, well, that makes one of you." Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he did something Ryan wasn't expecting. He sat back down. Didn't argue. Didn't try to convince him otherwise. Just stayed. Ryan turned his head slightly, watching him through narrowed eyes. Richard met his gaze, and for the first time, Ryan saw it. Not guilt, not regret, but determination. A silent promise. I'm not leaving. Ryan looked away. Because a part of him, the same part that still wanted to believe in the father he never had, wanted to believe it. And that terrified him more than anything. The price of redemption. The air in the hospital room felt heavy. Not with silence, but with something worse. Expectation. Ryan hated that feeling. It was the feeling he got before a foster parent sat him down and told him it wasn't working out. The feeling before a caseworker sighed and shuffled his paperwork, already thinking about the next problem on their list. The feeling before someone looked him in the eye and gave up on him. And yet Richard hadn't left. Ryan could feel his father's presence beside him. Solid, unmoving. The weight of it made his skin itch. He tried everything. Anger, sarcasm, silence. But the man was still sitting there, watching him like he was some kind of puzzle Richard Monroe couldn't figure out. Ryan wanted to tell him it was too late, that he wasn't some charity case Richard could fix. But for some stupid, infuriating reason, he couldn't say it. So instead, he just sat there, letting the hours stretch on, waiting for Richard to break first. Hours later, a test of conviction. By the time night fell, Ryan was sure Richard would be gone. He had given him every opportunity to leave. He had refused to talk, refused to acknowledge him, refused to do anything but stare at the wall like it held the answers to all his problems. But Richard stayed. He left only to grab coffee, to answer his phone, to check in with the nurse, but he always came back. It didn't make sense. People didn't stay for Ryan. People never stayed. And yet, as the hospital lights dimmed for the night shift, Richard was still there, sitting in that same damn chair, a medical journal in his lap that he wasn't reading. Ryan let out a slow, irritated breath. You don't have to stay, you know. Richard didn't look up from his journal. I know. Ryan's jaw tightened. So, why are you still here? This time, Richard did look at him, and his answer was simple. Because I should have been here a long time ago. Ryan's stomach twisted. It would have been easier if Richard had tried to defend himself, if he had made excuses, if he had tried to justify what he had done. But instead, he just took it. And that was harder to swallow. Ryan shifted in bed, staring at the ceiling. This doesn't change anything. Richard nodded. I know. Ryan let out a dry laugh. Then what are you even trying to do here? Richard's hands clasped together in his lap, his knuckles turning white. I don't know, he admitted. I just know I can't walk away this time. Ryan hated the way something in his chest clenched at those words. Because for once, they didn't feel like a lie. The escape plan. By the next morning, Ryan had made up his mind. He was leaving. He wasn't going to sit here, waiting for Richard Monroe to decide what kind of father he wanted to be. He wasn't going to wait for another conversation that would just end with more pain, more regret, more questions he didn't want answered. He'd done fine on his own. And he'd keep doing fine on his own. The moment the nurses did their morning rounds, he was gone. He'd done it before, countless times. He knew exactly how to slip out of a hospital unnoticed. He'd already started disconnecting himself from the monitors, pulling the IV carefully out of his arm to avoid setting off the alarms. His body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He'd dealt with worse. He reached for his bag, the only thing he had left in the world, but before he could swing his legs over the edge of the bed, Ryan. His body tensed. He turned, expecting anger, disappointment. Anything but what he saw on Richard's face. Understanding. Like he knew exactly what Ryan was doing. Like he had expected it. Ryan narrowed his eyes. Don't try to stop me. Richard didn't move, didn't rush toward him, didn't even argue. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, his face carefully neutral. "I won't," Richard said simply. Ryan hesitated. That was new. No pleading. No guilt trip. No, you have to stay. Just acceptance. And that made Ryan pause. "Where are you going to go?" Richard asked. Ryan shrugged. "Not your problem." Richard nodded. "Maybe not." He took a slow breath. "But you don't have anywhere, do you?" Ryan bristled. Richard wasn't mocking him. He wasn't judging him. But he was right. Ryan had nowhere. No apartment. No job. No safety net. Nothing. Just like always. Richard took a careful step forward. "Just stay for a couple more days. Let the stitches heal a little more. Then, if you still want to leave." He shrugged. "I won't stop you." Ryan's jaw tightened. "And why the hell should I trust you?" Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't," he admitted. "I haven't given you a reason to." Ryan blinked. Again, not the response he expected. For a long time, he just stared at Richard, waiting for the catch, waiting for him to say something selfish. But it never came. And for the first time, Ryan wasn't sure what to do. His body was exhausted. He could barely stand without shaking. And as much as he hated to admit it, Richard was right. He had nowhere else to go. Ryan exhaled sharply, swinging his legs back onto the bed. 2 days. That's it. Richard nodded once. "Okay." Ryan rolled his eyes. "Don't look so damn smug about it." Richard almost smiled. And for the first time since waking up in this hospital, Ryan felt something other than anger and resentment. He wasn't sure what it was yet. But it scared him. A tentative beginning. The 2 days turned into 4. Then a week. Ryan hated hospitals. But he hated leaving more. Because outside the hospital, the world was still the same. And Ryan didn't know if he had the strength to go back to it. Richard didn't push, didn't pressure him, didn't try to force anything. But he was there. And for the first time in Ryan's life, someone was waiting for him to get better. Not to fix him, not to erase the past, just to be there. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now.